Hi everyone, it's great to be part of this event today. My name is Ceara Gallagher and I'm an AHP consultant at the Public Health Agency, and I was also co-chair of the Regional Falls in Care Homes project. And I'm going to introduce Johnny, or he's going to introduce himself next.
Hello, I'm Johnny Graham. I live in Lisburn, and I've been involved as a user carer for about 8 years. I joined the Lisburn Integrated Care Partnership in 2016, and I've been involved in a whole range of things since then. And the very first thing I was exposed to was Falls. It was a Falls project which was taken forward in Lisburn, and I was just knocked out by the importance of it and how simple some of the solutions were. So when I was asked to join Ciara's team, I was absolutely delighted to do that.
No more delighted than we were, Johnny. So just to give a wee bit of context, the Falls and Care Homes project started in March 2021. Really challenging time, Johnny, in terms of COVID, but we kept at it. And I suppose what's so important around this piece is that we had everybody involved in it, Johnny. You know, there was yourself, we had a relative, we spoke to residents as well to hear what they wanted. And co-design was absolutely at the heart of the project from the get-go. So it wasn't about, here we've developed this pathway, coming to Johnny and other people and saying, what do you think? It was everybody doing it together. So Johnny was part of the oversight group as well as the task and finish group, and his voice and those other voices were absolutely paramount to how we developed the pathway, because there's no point in developing something around a room with people sitting going, I think this is what these people need, but actually it isn't. So that was probably the major success of the pathway, which did deliver 33% reduction in falls in the care homes, which is just so important and something that Johnny and I are very proud of. So Johnny, this is going to be a bit of a Parkinson's interview. I'm going to try and facilitate hearing from you, which is what this whole event is about, the power of engaging and involving people with that lived experience. So in terms of the first question, Johnny, about how did you become involved in this project?
Uh, well, I was at a webinar on Falls, and Gillian McKee, who was a Lisburn uh, Falls Prevention Manager in Lisburn. Uh, I was impressed with what I was hearing, and we got into conversation, and I think she thought I might be useful to this, and she asked, would I be interested? And I said I definitely would, because I've a fair bit of a falling experience myself. I suffer is perhaps not the word, for I've got low blood pressure, and I have fallen a couple of times, well, 3 or 4 times actually, when I was on medication. I'm not likely to fall from that now because I'm so careful. I know what to do, and I'm very cautious about it. And indeed, I'm very reluctant to take medication that, that might lead to that. Uh, but also, I watched my mother topple in front of me when she was about 78 and fall to the ground, and I could see how possible likely this was. And then the thing that really motivated me was one of my oldest friends. She was in her late 80s, and she was in a care home with dementia, and she fell, and she lay there for 7 hours, a long lie. And that more than anything else motivated me. I could see in the future I might need this sort of stuff, and I could see the consequences of a fall, and I knew about the fear of a fall. I have it's a healthy fear of falling, which I manage, but I recognize what a huge issue it is. So I thought this is a no-brainer. It's not going to be that difficult to make progress on this if we do the right things.
Thank you, Johnny, and thank you for sharing your personal experience and your loved ones' experience in that. Um, so in terms of, being part of the project, Johnny, what did you find being part of the project in terms of what were the challenges for you? You know, what were there any barriers or things that didn't help you during the course of the project?
Well, not really. That's because it was such a good project. I mean, I think the fear that I would have uh, when I get involved in something is that I won't be listened to. I mean, I've done a little bit of thinking in and around involvement and co-production and so on. And what we as users want is we want to be recognized, we want to be valued, we want to be heard. Heard is not just apparently listening, but to realize that the points that we're making are being uh, taken on board. And I think from the very outset, I felt that I felt very comfortable in the team. That you led it really well. All the people around the table struck me as they were really keen to get it done. I didn't see any cynics sitting on the side. What on earth are we doing this for? Because they're a disaster to any improvement project. So from the outset, the atmosphere that which had been created, and I tell you, I've been in some things where it's not like that. And back in my own career, if I felt somebody wasn't listening to me, I just walked away. I wouldn't be interested. So you need to feel that you're being listened to, and that the points that you're making are being taken over. You don't have to agree with them, and they mightn't be deployed, but you have to be sure they've actually thought about them. And because I come up with lots of ideas, lots of silly ideas, but some of them are good, and I don't mind if it's not employed as long as I feel as though it's been properly considered. And I did feel that right through the project, which is one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much.
Absolutely, Johnny. And I don't believe there's any silly suggestions ever, particularly in quality improvement, because it's sometimes those little nuggets
Yeah,
that actually can have the most
but
profound
this is the
effect.
biggest barrier to a user. There's an awful lot of people, I'm not one of them, who's afraid to ask what seems like a silly question. I believe that about silly questions because there'll be somebody else in the room that's thinking something similar. So you've got to be able to persuade user carers to ask a question, whether they think it's stupid or not. There's no question that doesn't add to the conversation.
I totally agree. And as you know, Johnny, and we've talked and chatted about this before, is that by having all of those different perspectives in the team, and I think team's really important, and that the service user feels equal part of the team, is that by having all of those different perspectives, be it, you know, the care home assistant to a relative to someone who's working in commissioning or whoever it is, that all of those perspectives is what brings the richness and the direction of the project. And
And if the
yeah,
right atmosphere is created, relationships build steadily and trust is built quite quickly. And trust is very important, obviously, to any uh, exercise like this. So, yeah, very important.
absolutely. And Johnny, you talked about the importance of being heard, being valued, being an equal voice. What was it, because I know you've mentioned this to me before, but what was it that happened in the process of the project that
Well,
actually gave you concrete sort of example or affirmation that your opinion was absolutely so important?
well, this is perhaps the best example of all the involvement that I've had. Because when you join a group like that, you're not necessarily going to know unless somebody comes and tells you, look, you're making a big contribution. And that's not, the world tends not to be like that. But at the very first meeting, I went into that uh, project very anxious to speak up. I call them loved ones, relatives, whatever you want to call them, because they have a very difficult time. I can tell you because my mother-in-law lived with us for 18 months with dementia. It is extremely difficult, extremely stressful. And I almost want to look after the loved one more than the dementia person, which sounds a bit odd. But there's a real role to play in that. And at the very first meeting, I set sail as I was intending to do to speak up for the loved ones. And I made a point about the importance of doing so and tried to stress the effect that this would have on them within integrated care. And it was Jerry Miller, who's a well known GP on that committee, and he responded to me and said, "That's a very insightful comment." Those words, "That's a very insightful comment," point that Johnny makes, was the moment that I knew I was in a place that it was worth being. So it was very direct. He probably didn't even know he was doing it. So it's a very important point for me. It's the best example of this that I've had in all the involvement that I've had.
And I think that I would say that for everybody around a room as well, Johnny. Sometimes somebody, when you're brave enough to put something across,
Yes.
for someone to say, that's something to think about, or it's that kind of acknowledgement that you're on the same page, and you've got something, as you said, that's going to
I've
be
got a
listened to.
I have a bee in my bonnet. I worked for the public sector for 35 years, and I had coming up with silly ideas all the time. And all I ever got was, but. There's something, this is the reason it won't work. I don't like but. That's interesting. Let's talk about that. And that's what happened to that. There were no buts. Every idea, however odd. So people
That's really good.
tend to come up with but it won't work because it's not whether the actual suggestion will work, but it takes you further along in terms of developing it. So no buts.
That's really good because the adbots just close everything down, don't
Yeah.
they? It's and particularly with our health service and the need for transformation, we don't need the bots, we need the how do we? How
And
can we?
a good example of that is where we're trying to develop digital services for older people. And somebody will say, but there's an awful lot of people out there who don't use digital services. Well, there are actually only about 20% of older people. So we're going to dismiss the idea when there are 80% who will benefit. And that was something that has come to me fairly recently. We got to be careful that we don't, and the health service, I fear, tends to do this because we can't touch the whole 100%. We tend to dismiss it a little bit. Uh, but that's, yeah.
That's absolutely, it's so important because we're all diverse people at different stages of our life journey. So it's so important we don't overgeneralize. And Johnny, we were really lucky to get you, and to listen to the residents. As you know, that was really important as well with the interviews and the surveys, and that engagement as we went along. But we were very lucky with you in that you had, well, you'd great experience in your professional career, but also that you had been involved as a service user before you came into this project. And I suppose if you could think about, what can we do better in terms of really truly involving people, bringing them into a project, or whatever it is that we're trying to hear others' lived experience, voices. What can we do better to enable that? Maybe someone
Right.
who has no experience.
Yeah, well, right. Um, I think you need to remember what I said at the start, which is we need to be recognized, we need to be valued, and we need to be heard. So not only it needs to be seen to be, we need to feel that. And I think uh, inducting somebody into a project is clearly very important. And I've been thinking about this. I was involved with this during COVID, so you couldn't have met me in person. I don't like Teams uh, and Zoom unless I've met the people. I mean, I've done it on lots of it, and it's all perfectly understandable. So I think that it should start with a one-to-one meeting. Whether it could be Teams if the person themselves uh, doesn't want to meet in person, and it might be somebody who's struggling and or with mental health problems or disability problems, and they're very happy to do it digitally or online like this. So I think that's the first thing, uh, and I do think the odd conversation, how is it going? Uh, that was a great point you made. I've already alluded to some of that stuff, and I think that if you see a user care, I was involved in another project. It was the hyponatremia implementation project, which was happened about 5 years ago, and I sat with another user care, and he never said very much. Uh, And he was just one of those people who doesn't speak. The room was filled with chief executives, and that doesn't bother me in the slightest. I'll pipe up, but he didn't say very much. And whenever he did say something, he had so much to say. And I remember from my working life the sort of quiet, retiring people who have an awful lot to say. So I think it's important that a chairman turns to a user at every meeting and says, is there anything you have, or at a specific moment where there's bound to be a user or a care input, just say, Johnny, have you any thoughts on that? That's not rocket science. Simple stuff. So the person who never speaks should be asked. And some people do that, but some chairmen don't do that.
It's and again, I know I've chatted to you about this, Johnny, in my learning as well, in my journey of working, collectively. I think that's something that we missed out at the start of this project, that pre-meet. Just to kind of say, look, this is your role, this is my role, just to set out the context of the project, just have that kind of, as you say, one-to-one meet before they come into that big room, or be it virtually or in person. And I think you're absolutely right. That face to face is so important. And I think, for some people, they may not want it. And absolutely, you got to listen to that. But there's something about building up a relationship. And we talked about trust.
Yeah.
As well. And I think that is so important. So, Johnny, just in summary, just listening to you today, I think these are some of your top tips. You can correct me, and hopefully I have heard you and listened. But you've talked about recognized, valued, heard, pre-meet. If you have service users who maybe aren't as confident to speak up, giving them that opportunity in meetings and giving them that space to reflect, creating an atmosphere of trust as well, and making people feel comfortable is really important as well. And just in closing, there was one other thing you said to me was about enjoyment.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps you attending as well, and that passion that you're making a difference.
It took me quite a while to realize why I found being a user carer is so important. That some weird ideas about doing good and altruistic, and that was true. And I would say to people, well, in 10 years, I'm going to need this. So it's a bit of an insurance policy. But when I finally thought my way through it, I realized the reason I do it is because I enjoy it. And I wouldn't do it. I would walk away tomorrow if I wasn't enjoying it. That's what I taught myself.
It's so important, isn't it, for all of us? It's that feeling of enjoyment, of purpose, of direction and value. And Johnny, thank you so much for doing this interview today, and sharing those experiences. And I can never thank you enough for what you brought to our project, and the experience that you gave me as well was absolutely invaluable. And I've always enjoyed working with you as well. But thank you so much, Johnny.
My pleasure.